Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson, the first one of this year. We're going to be looking at a kind of general overview of oil painting or layering in oil painting. So it's going to be a materials lesson. I'm not going to be doing any demonstrating, just explaining some stuff, doing a little bit of diagramming. So the idea of this is to get you kind of comfortable with the most important aspects of layering in oil paint, and that'll kind of touch on types of mediums that you use as you paint, why you use certain types of mediums at certain times, and how you then varnish your piece. And also on top of that, we'll initially look at how you prepare a surface to paint on. I think sort of materials and the layered nature of oil paint is probably the most intimidating aspect about the medium. But once you get to grips with it, it's fairly straightforward. And then in general, I would say oil paint is a nicely forgiving medium, certainly compared to things like watercolor, which require a lot of kind of forethought as you build up your painting. Oil paint can always be corrected. In that way, it's sort of similar to acrylics, but allows for a bit more variety of luster and texture, which is always nice. So it's a medium I actually recommend to beginners, even though it tends to be a bit daunting. So hopefully this lesson will help kind of allay some of your concerns about how you can approach oil painting as a beginner. So the first thing we want to think about is the surface that we paint on. So oil painting through the ages have been made on a number of different surfaces. Traditionally, they were always made on wooden panels, so solid wooden panels. But because those panels could be very heavy, and over time, and this is in the context of European art, over time the artists were producing works that might need to be shipped quite far. They became more mobile. It necessitated the creation of a surface that would be lighter to transport and more manageable to transport, which is why canvases were created. So canvases are not actually, while generally considered the ideal surface nowadays, traditionally a preferred surface was a wooden surface because it's very solid and stable. Canvas, because it's a fabric, is inherently flexible, and it changes shape as the weave changes, which can lead to problems like cracking that you'll see in paintings in galleries. But the advantage is you can take paint canvas off the stretchers that you've stretched it onto originally, roll it up, ship it with the stretchers or without, anywhere you like, can be re-stretched, and it weighs next to nothing compared to an equivalently sized panel painting. So it's a very good flexible surface to work on, which is why it became so popular. Nowadays, you can also use things like aluminium panels for painting, so aluminium's become more popular. Most metals you can actually paint on if you create a sort of surface that's bound enough. And I've seen some really nice pieces on metal in exhibitions by other artists. And I think I've done a couple myself actually, and it is quite a nice surface to paint on, but it's similar to wood. So you start with your surface, whatever you happen to be painting on, and then that surface has to be prepared. And a lot of you, I imagine, will buy pre-prepared canvases from shops, and that's totally fine. I tend to buy large rolls of canvas that has already been primed, which is what I'm going to talk about now. And all I have to do is stretch that onto some stretchers, but you can also it's common to buy packs of pre-stretched canvases. So when you start with a fabric, if we're going to look at fabric, and the same rules apply to wood and fabric, but start with a fabric like cotton or linen. Linen is generally the preferred surface to work on, but it is a bit more expensive than cotton. You've got your fabric and you want to paint on it. If you were to paint directly onto raw fabric that's just stretched with oil paint, the oil paint will over time start to eat away at the fabric because oil paint is acidic. So you need to protect both wood, so if you're working in wood, can also be eaten away by oil paint. Over a matter of decades I'm talking about, not like immediately. But oil paint is slightly acidic. So as it sits on a surface, if that surface isn't a barrier to that acidity, it will slowly degrade it. So there are instances of paintings that are in collections now that were painted in sort of the 20th century, when people were less concerned about the longevity of work. Paintings were made directly onto things like cardboard, which is super susceptible, or paper. And those paintings are actually becoming difficult to kind of keep together for conservators in galleries. So they're having to mount them onto other surfaces in order to protect the piece from falling apart entirely. But traditionally what they used to do was you'd have your surface, and you would prepare it with, in the old days it was rabbit skin glue. So you put like a coat of rabbit skin glue all over it. That would tend to make the surface a bit more tight. So you would usually stretch your canvas, then put rabbit skin glue. That would make it tight, a bit like a drum. And the rabbit skin glue was the primary barrier against acidity. And then over the rabbit skin glue, they would then put a fresh gesso, so another coat, fresh gesso, usually white, or they would do a coat of oil paint that would then become the white ground layer. So you call that a ground. Sometimes it's referred to as the gesso, which is the Italian word. And that would usually be either a mixture of oil and rabbit skin glue, or just oil with white pigment suspended in it, some sort of white pigment. Traditionally it was always lead white, but lead isn't used as much anymore because of concerns about toxicity. So nowadays you would use a titanium white ground generally. So you put your ground, and that becomes the surface you paint on. So you've got these two layers. You've got over the fabric, you've got your fabric or your wood, then you've got rabbit skin glue, and then you've got your gesso, or your oil ground that will make the surface white, and then that gives you your typical white canvas. Nowadays, the same process is followed, but use different mediums. So rabbit skin glue has been replaced by acrylic polymers, which is usually a similar sort of medium to the type of medium that you suspend acrylic paints in. So it's kind of like PVA glue almost, is what it sort of feels like. There are some different makers of this if you do it yourself, but if you buy them pre-bought, this will already have been done. So they still apply this coat. It's kind of like a clear glue coat, which creates the barrier from the acidity of the oil penetrating into the fabric. Then over the top of that, you can still do an oil ground or a traditional gesso, or more and more common is to do they call it a universal gesso or universal ground, which is just, again, using acrylic medium with white mixed in it. It's basically white acrylic paint, or what do they call it in house paint? A bit like kind of white typical house paint almost. Slightly different formulation, but that's essentially what it is. And again, it creates a white surface to paint on. So that's how you prepare your surface. The main thing in terms of preparation is you want something that will protect the canvas from being eaten away by acid and the oils over time. And then you need a ground which isn't too absorbent, because if you've ever experienced painting on fabrics or painting directly onto paper with oils, those surfaces that are uncoated will sort of soak the oil out of your paint. And different types of preparations of the surface will react differently when you paint. So you might find sometimes you get a canvas and it reacts really well to the paint. It's really nice to work on. It's just the right kind of level of absorption versus being able to kind of spread paint over the surface. Sometimes it might be too slick, so I've prepared surfaces in the past and really sanded them down on wood, and they become almost glossy to paint on. And then you'll find your brush is sort of slipping around and you can't kind of get nice grippy brush strokes. Whereas the other end of the spectrum is it's too absorbent, and then you kind of put a brush stroke down and it gets absorbed and just drags out too quickly. So somewhere in between that is ideal, a kind of semi-absorbent surface. That's what you're going for. And generally, if you buy something from a shop pre-made, it'll be like that. If you want to try really high quality surfaces to work on, you can look at kind of bigger art shops if they've got oil. Linens prepared in oil grounds tend to be the best, and if it's double coated, that's better. So they do kind of 2 coats of oil ground. Creates a really nice surface to work on. But you can prepare your own. So I mean, wood is probably a good place to start if you just get some plywood panels to work on, and you can just sand them down, put a coat of, you can use PVA, or you can use a thing called GAC 100, which is from Golden, which is a acrylic paint company. You can usually find that online. You just put a coat of that on the front. It's good to put a coat of that on the back because it stops the panel from warping depending on how thick it is. And you let that dry, then you do a coat of acrylic gesso, which you can pick up from any art shop. A few coats of that, kind of sand it between depending on how smooth you want the surface, and you've got a panel that you can work directly on. And it tends to work out a lot cheaper than buying them online. And the same goes for canvases. So if you buy your canvas by the meter as a fabric, get a staple gun and buy your own stretchers, you'll be able to get much higher quality canvases to paint on for the same price as cheaper packs of pre-made canvases. So I recommend trying it out. I think I've made if you go back through the lessons, there's a lesson about how to stretch a canvas, and it's really not too hard. But yeah, that's it for the surface. So we've prepared the surface, then we can do our painting on it. So this is where it gets slightly tricky. People always get a little bit confused, so if you need to rewatch this video, you're welcome to do so. But essentially, you have your oil paint that comes out of the tube, and it's quite thick. So when oil paint comes out of the paint tube, it's fairly viscous, and you want it to be, very often, you can work directly in paint like that, but very often you want to make it thinner so it's easier to spread. So to make it easier to spread, you want to add some sort of thinner. Now where it gets a bit complex is oil paint tends to use 2 thinners. So one is some sort of solvent, which is like mineral spirits or turpentine. So you got a solvent, which could be mineral spirits or turpentine. I would always recommend that people use odorless mineral spirits over gum turpentine or those sorts of things, just because it tends to be less hazardous to breathe. And always when you're working in oils, have a reasonable amount of ventilation. It's not good for you at all to work in closed environments with these sorts of solvents. So it's a solvent that's bad to inhale if you're working with it. The other thing that you mix your mediums from is linseed oil, which is actually a form of flaxseed oil, but it's rancid flaxseed oil, so people call it linseed. Linseed doesn't actually exist. So linseed oil, we don't actually need brackets for that, but linseed oil is not hazardous to inhale. It's just an oil. Some linseed oils you could probably cook with, to be honest. So that's totally fine for you. It's the solvent that's not so good for you. Linseed oil is what the oil paint is made out of, typically. There are other types of oils that are used nowadays. Sometimes people use safflower, sometimes people use walnut, but for the sake of this, let's just talk about linseed oil. But basically use some sort of oil. So linseed oil is good, or any oil that you use to paint is good because it dries. So not all oils dry. Things like olive oil don't dry. So there's a story about the Italians in the Renaissance. Were trying to make linseed oil like the Germans did in the Northern Renaissance. And their paintings weren't drying totally, and they didn't know why. And it turned out it was because they were making their linseed oil on the same presses as their olive oil. And so olive oil was contaminating the linseed oil and stopping it from being able to fully cure. But basically we use some sort of oil and some sort of solvent, and then we've got our paint. And between these 3 things, we're mixing our paint that we apply to the surface of the canvas. And the important thing is you have to apply them in the right ratio as you work. So as you're creating a layered painting, now this doesn't matter if you're doing an alla prima painting, you're painting everything at once. You could use any combination of these that you like, because it's just you're gonna paint it and it'll dry and that's it. But very often when people work in oils, they layer, so they make corrections, or there are really complex ways of making abstract paintings that rely on a lot of layering over time. When you're layering, you need to bear in mind that oil paint needs to be applied in a fat over lean fashion. So I'm going to write that down and now try to explain it. So fat over lean, which is the best way I've come across to remember it. That was how I remembered it when I was taught this principle. So what that means is you want to paint each subsequent layer with a greater proportion of oil to solvent. The reason being, oil dries slowly. And mineral spirits or turpentine solvents, they dry, sorry about my terrible writing, they dry fast. And what happens if you imagine you have lots of layers of an oil painting, maybe like 7 layers. If this layer up here is made from just solvent, and this layer is made from, or these layers are made from mixtures that have more oil or are just pure oil, these layers are going to dry slower than that layer. So this layer will dry rock hard within a few days. These layers, oil paint takes years and years to dry. So these layers will be drying for a long time underneath this top layer. And what that means is this layer gets hard and it gets brittle. These layers stay soft and they shift around. And if they shift around even slightly, they can start to cause this top thinner layer to crack. That's when you see visible cracking in paintings, or one of the reasons. So you always want to try to make sure you start your painting with mixtures of either pure, I always start paintings with pure solvent, but as you carry on with the painting, each day that you go back, it's pretty much by day, the next day that you go back to work on it, don't work in pure mineral spirits as your medium, add a little bit of oil to that mineral spirit mixture. The next time you come back, make sure you add more oil than you did the previous time. So each layer, so you got 1, 2, 3, 4 layers, as you go up and you add more layers to that painting, you're using more oil in your medium mixture. You can buy pre-prepared mediums, but I never see the point. I always think you're better off just buying oils and some sort of odorless mineral spirit, and you mix your own mediums each time that you work. You can pre-mix them into jars. You could buy 5 jars and have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you know that 1 is pure mineral spirits, and 5 is maybe sort of 3/4 oil, 1/4 linseed oil. Solvent. You know that that's got a lot of oil and that's got no oil, and in between you create a gradation of mediums that have different proportions of oil in them. But that's pretty much the most important thing about it. So it's just being aware of the fact that as you mix subsequent layers, try to make sure that there's more oil to solvent as a ratio. So you might start with kind of, this slide up here. So you might say you've got oil, solvent, and you start with, say 1 part oil to 5 parts solvent. Then the next medium, you make it 2 parts oil to 4 parts solvent, which is 1 to 2. The next time you'd make it 3 to 3 parts, which is 1 to 1. So that's half and half, your third mixture. Then you make it 4 to 2, and then you can make it 5 to 1. So you see the oil is increasing in the ratio and the solvent is decreasing. So that's just for each layer, each time you work on it. When you work on an oil painting, you always let each subsequent layer dry, or each layer dry before you add anything new, which, depending on the type of paint you're using and the mediums, will vary and how cold it is and so on. But don't try to avoid working into semi-wet layers because that starts to confuse things a bit and can lead to cracking problems as well. It's not a hard and fast rule. I mean, none of this is sort of a total rule that you have to follow sort of absolutely, but it's something to be aware of as you're working, because it does add to the kind of the quality of your work if you're aware of these sorts of rules about how you use oil paints. So it's definitely worth doing, and it makes it easier to work as well, because if you start and you were just using loads of oil in your mixtures, beyond the fact it might start to cause cracking problems in the future, you'll find that each layer of oil starts to make the surface slicker and slicker, smoother and smoother, like we were talking about when you prepare your surface, which then means it's really hard to paint over really oily surfaces. And when you come to varnish, you might find that the varnish kind of slips off the oil. So you never want to get to a point where you've got so much oil built up that it's become kind of glossy as a surface. That's not good. So kind of be aware of that as you're creating paintings, and think about what you're doing and what effect it's having. So that's the main principle in terms of how you mix mediums and how you layer. It's called fat over lean, so just try to remember that. You can always refer back to this video if you need. And the final thing to think about is varnishing. So we've prepared our surface, we've then painted our painting, and we've layered it. Ideally, before varnishing, you want to leave it. I mean, people say 12 months is the ideal. That's a long time if you're making paintings and you're exhibiting them. I would generally say aim for about 3 months if you can. But in theory, a painting is dry by usually a week after the last coat, week to 2 weeks, something like that. And you can theoretically varnish it at that point. The only risk is that the varnish layer will typically be a bit brittle, like we were talking about before with this layering approach. And it means that you might get some cracking in the varnish, but hopefully not. If you were to wait 12 months, you're a lot more safe in terms of varnish cracking. It depends how you varnish though. I mean, I tend to put a pretty thin layer of varnish. If you're putting a really thick coat, cracking will be a bigger issue because it'll be more visible. So you've made your painting, you've let it dry, ideally a few months, then you can apply your varnish. I might do a specific lesson about varnishing, but basically you can either brush on varnish. Usually this is the approach. You either brush it on with liquid varnish out of a bottle, or you spray it on. I'd recommend spraying just because it's a lot more convenient. It gives you a good even coat over the whole surface. If you are spraying, one thing to think about, I'll just give you a quick kind of advice about this. You want to spray, keep it tilted upright when you first spray it on because it's better for the can. So the painting is upright, kind of leaning slightly against some sort of wall. Ideally in a very well ventilated studio or outside, because sprays have solvents in them as well. So you keep it kind of tilted upright. I'll put it on here. So you've got your wall there, and then you want your painting kind of tilted up against the wall, and you use your spray paint to kind of spray gradually. You kind of snake down around the surface of the painting and just give it kind of a thin, even coat. Let that dry. If you're using a kind of store-bought varnish nowadays, that'll usually be dry in about 2 hours, whatever the can says. And then just do another thin coat. You're better off doing multiple thin coats than one really thick coat. When you're letting it dry, just move it to a dust-free area and lie it flat until it's dry, which means that the surface of the varnish will remain fairly stable. But yeah, I think that's it. So feel free to ask any questions below. I'll get back to you about them. And as always, click through the link to check out OCAD Studio and sign up if you like for tutoring from myself and other tutors. But otherwise, I'll see you guys next week, and I hope you enjoyed the lesson.